Welcome, everyone. This is Justin Stofron and another edition of You're Probably Getting Screwed interviews. I'm really excited. This week, our guest is Keldon Bester, the executive director of the Canadian Antimonopoly Project. We're going to talk about tariffs and monopolies north of the border, and maybe a little Toronto Blue Jays outlook, depending where we go. Keldon, I just wanted to give you the opportunity, though, to kind of build off that and introduce yourself and your organization.
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me. As Justin said, I run CAMP, which is a think tank dedicated to monopoly issues in Canada. We've been around since about 2022 and working on issues both domestically and, as we'll be talking about today, internationally as well.
So I wanted to start. You recently put out a Canadian anti-monopoly agenda. It's across various sectors, a whole series of policy proposals to address consolidation and concentration in the country. And one of the things that stood out to me is how you positioned the agenda and the fight against monopoly power within the context of the trade turmoil at the moment between the U.S. and Canada. And in particular, you write about the need for an anti-monopoly approach that is skeptical of dependence and emphasizes diversity and resilience. And so what's in the plan? Can you give us a little bit about that, and then how it fits within that trade framework?
Yeah, so in Canada, we're about to have a federal election. And so, whatever the outcome, the government is going to have to tackle a monopoly problem both at home and internationally. I think the situation that Canada finds ourselves in vis-a-vis the US is itself a bit of a monopoly problem. We had one buyer for a lot of our goods. We had one trading partner that we depended on too heavily, it seems. And while it seemed like a good deal at the time, we're now dealing with, the issue that we deal with in individual markets with monopolies. We just aren't in control. We aren't in the driver's seat. So what the agenda has is ideas across, transportation, communication, digital markets, our food system, all ways that we can make our economy more resilient to these external forces, but also make those domestic markets, which, we have our own homegrown monopolies as well as international and American monopolies. We need to get a better deal for Canadians in those markets as well. So, like I say, we really are looking at the monopoly problem, both when it comes to companies, but countries as well.
You mentioned the election, so to get into to politics a little bit, Canada has a new prime minister in Mark Carney of the Liberal Party, who's a former central banker, and has just recently, last couple of days, taken over for Justin Trudeau. There's an election that I was reading right before this. It seems like maybe will be called for end of April, but maybe isn't totally set just yet. But I'm curious what impact you think that election will have on anti-monopoly policy in Canada.
Yeah, well, there's positives and negatives possible in both outcomes. So we're lucky in Canada in that competition and anti-monopoly policy has been actually quite cross-partisan. So we received amendments to our sort of big antitrust or competition law in 2023 and 2024. And those were brought in by the Liberal government, but they received unanimous support from federal MPs of Conservative as well as the New Democratic Party as well as the Bloc Québécois. So we're lucky in that sense, but we're unlucky in that I think there's a real big test coming for whichever federal party is elected, and that is, fundamentally about on the international side, are we willing to stand up to these, in particular major tech firms, which the Trump administration has said we're going to be going after countries that, push back against the power of these firms. And are we going to allow, the companies that were treating us poorly, but are also Canadian, to wrap themselves in the flag? So I think both the Liberal and Conservative governments or potential governments have shown positive signs about taking monopoly seriously in areas like food and banking. But we really are in for a test of just the mettle of those parties, whoever ends up forming government, really.
Speaking of big tech, you wrote in the Toronto Star recently about Canada's integration with American tech firms like Google, Meta, Amazon. and how originally that integration was sort of seen as a potential beneficial thing for Canada. Can you talk some more though about the risks this now poses, both in this moment and probably just broadly?
Yeah, no, that was an important piece, and I'm glad it was published. What we're talking about there is, something that is very familiar to any Canadian is the prevalence of services like those from Google, those from Meta, Amazon, so on and so forth, Microsoft even. Again, I think for a long time, policymakers and sort of the think tank crowd thought of these companies as a bit separate from the individual countries and their respective governments. And in the case of Canada, we said, well, these are American firms. We're good friends with America. What is there to worry about? But as we've seen this relationship between Canada and the U.S. change very rapidly, I anticipate, and I bet you before the end of the year, we actually find ourselves in this situation that our dependence on these firms, from anything from search to communication, how we access information online, I bet we start seeing this as a bit of a line drawn, not just against antitrust action against Google, for example, with the Competition Bureau in Canada bringing a case against them, sometime later this year, but I think more in this high level sort of trade negotiation. Threats to cut off access to something like cloud computing services, I think, are entirely within the realm of possibilities. So that's kind of the next frontier for this, but we really are talking about the limits of our sovereignty, which is not where I thought we would be 2 months ago.
Yeah, goodness. You mentioned earlier homegrown monopolies can be an issue. I do think that in the American context, we often think of either American firms, or we think of these firms as multinational firms. I'm wondering if there's one particular homegrown monopolist that you think about, or that is particularly important at the moment that folks should know.
Yeah, who's the worst? I mean, it's a good question. I mean, one that is always in the background, and I think in Canada there's been a lot of talk about interprovincial trade. Trading with ourselves. And I think we really need to look at the companies that we depend on to really get goods across the country. So, I'm out here still railing that we need to talk about the railroads as much as we need to talk about Google or Amazon. And I think that's been underappreciated, that they're kind of in the background. One of them is, I think, 10% of it is owned by Bill Gates. I mean, that's a topic for another conversation. But we really need to go back to these sort of foundational markets. How do we move? Canada's a massive country. We're basically a line of people all along the U.S. border. We really need to focus on moving people, goods, and ideas as freely and as efficiently as possible. So while these big tech questions, I think, are very front of mind, we need to go back and tackle some of the oldest monopolies that this country has had.
Yeah, I find that in my professional life, I often tell folks, Farmers Union is born out of fights with the rail and grain monopolists of yesteryear, but they're kind of back and present today. Regarding you mentioned sort of where people's focus is on some of these issues, and I do find from an advocacy standpoint that talking to policymakers about how prevalent consolidation across the economy is both important but can be challenging, because folks think of it as a tech issue, or maybe they think of it as a food system issue. Do you find that same sort of challenge in educating policymakers and maybe even the public in Canada?
Well, I don't know if I would call it a challenge, but actually it's been the best opportunity we've had it, and particularly the cost of living situation in Canada, centered on but not limited to food. So food has actually been the way that we've started bigger conversations in Canada. People are very upset about what they see on the grocery store shelf, and we're here to say, hey, glad you're here, but the bad news is that this extends not only much deeper into the food supply chain, but into every other market. The same goes for a long pain point for Canadians is the cost of our telecom, cell phone and internet service. And so those points, I find, are the entryway to have a bigger conversation about this same phenomenon is happening in other parts of the country, in other parts of our economy. This is the one way you experience it every day, but it's actually affecting you in ways you might not realize.
Have you, so you've been at this a couple of years. What's been the experience in terms of, getting policymakers to think about this issue? Because I know it's even in the American context, I feel like it's still somewhat emerging, and then particularly within the state level context that I'm in, it's even newer to come and talk to state legislators about antitrust. And so I'm wondering, where you see the conversation at the moment in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, today the conversation is totally dominated by the future of our relationship with the US, and fundamentally a question of where do we go from here. So we are one voice and one angle into that conversation. Again, I go back to the fact that this ultimately is a monopoly problem, and the same principles and values that I think anti-monopoly organizations bring really are the answer to the moment. Prior to that, I found at the federal level, policymakers actually really understood the issue, and it was finding out which elements really resonate with their constituents and painting a picture of what we could actually do differently. Because a lot of this stuff is quite it can be quite depressing. You say, well, we had all these mergers 20 years ago, and now we're stuck with this. And what our job is to lay out a plan to say, well, not only are we not stuck with it, but we've sort of been here before. Other countries have been here before, and there is a way out of it. So, our work this year and in the coming years will be on building that more resilient and independent Canadian economy. And frankly, I think an anti-monopoly approach is the way to do it.
Yeah, I always tell people there's nothing about monopoly that is inevitable. I want to make sure to plug letters from camp, which is your weekly newsletter. Love getting that each week. Anything else that you want to either plug or that I haven't touched on here?
Well, no, I appreciate it. And yeah, that's a weekly newsletter. It goes out on Sunday for a bit of a Canadian as well as international view on anti monopoly. I think this is a moment of disruption and dislocation, particularly between the relationship between our two countries. But, I'm confident that we have, shared work to do. And the problems facing Canadians really are similar to the ones facing Americans. They take on very different flavors. But I guess my pitch is, as the two countries' economies may begin to move apart from one another, I think the work very much still is, just like the multinationals operating in all these different countries, the work to push back and get a fairer deal for not just Canadians, but Americans, Europeans, and people around the world. I think that remains fundamentally an international collaborative effort.
Well, Keldon, thank you so much for taking the time, and make sure to everyone that's listening that you check out the newsletter, check out Camp's work, and keep up the good work.
Thanks so much.